Good morning. My name is Richard Fahey, and I'm with the Skoll Foundation. And I am excited and privileged to introduce this morning's panel on accelerating systems change, making possibility real. This session brings together proven systems change leaders within social entrepreneurship and philanthropy. The panelists will explore how systems change unearths the root causes of critical societal challenges and gathers a wide range of actors and collaborators to make a lasting impact. Now, before we get to systems change, I need to talk about some behavior change. Please silence your mobile phones. That's first. Second, please wait for a microphone before speaking when we get to the Q&A. We are filming this session and cannot hear your questions unless you speak into the microphone. The session is scheduled to end at 11:15, and after the session, please take a few seconds to fill out these forms, and there's 3 questions. You can add a 4th one, rating the quality of the introducer. And, okay, session over. The delegate-led sessions start at 11:45. If you're going to attend one of those, we recommend that you pick up lunch and go to the session. You can eat there, and there's a little bit of time afterwards also. So with that, I'll introduce our esteemed moderator, Sally Osberg, who is the founding president of the Skoll Foundation. And Sally and I worked together for 14 years. I just have to say, I and others have had countless riveting, challenging, insightful conversations with Sally. We're all in for a treat. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. And may I just ask all of you to give Richard a round of applause, because Richard acted as interim president, and it was truly an act of service and love. But let's just dive in. We're here for accelerating systems change, making possibility real. And let's start by making systems real. How many of you took a flight to get here to the UK and Oxford? Most of you. How many of you actually looked in that seat pocket in front of you and pulled out the card to make sure you weren't on a Boeing 737 MAX 8? How many of you? Okay, a few of you. You know they're all grounded, but we want to make sure, right? Well, there's an example of a system that you were encountering. And of course, every day we all engage with and encounter myriad and multiple systems. But this one is an example of a very complex system. You, of course, are a customer. You're a customer of an airline. An airline is a customer of a manufacturer, and the manufacturer has designers and engineers and a whole host of folks. But we rely upon the checks and safety regulators and everybody else who has responsibility in that system for securing our safety, for getting us here safely. And we know, of course, that we now know, if we didn't already, we know there's some flaws in this system. So how many of you think that this wake-up call for the system is going to result in permanent, enduring change? Okay, not very many. Well, that makes my point. Systems change is hard. And all the incentives keep the system in a status quo mode and resistant to change. So each of these esteemed folks here is going to be able to speak to those challenges, to that aspiration, to the real on-the-ground challenges, and the importance of the work. And just allow me, before we dive in, to talk a little bit about systems change as the new buzzword in philanthropy, or buzz phrase in philanthropy. But in fact, there's nothing new about systems and systems change. And the work of the hard, enduring, arc work of systems change. It's long-term work. It doesn't turn on a dime. And it's the work that we are all doing. At the Skoll World Forum, we begin with a premise. And that premise is that social entrepreneurs aspire to, and create models designed to change systems. We have an awful lot of wonderful people in the world who engage in acts of social purpose and social service and social activism, but social entrepreneurs are after the big prize, and that big prize is enduring systems change. We have a remarkable panel here of folks who actually know what they're talking about because they have been in those systems. They understand the context. They understand the culture. They have been of those systems. So their legitimacy is fantastic and unrivaled. Ma Jun, of course, is the founder of the Institute for Public and Environmental Affairs, based in Beijing. Remarkable legacy of working with the Chinese government and corporations to return China to blue skies and clear water. And how about that beautiful blue sky we had coming and walking over here today? It was beautiful, wasn't it? And it's a rare thing when you see that blue sky in China, but that's the aspiration. Safeena Husain cut her teeth as a development professional working in the field. She also has a really rich background in economic history at LSE, and she founded Educate Girls, which is based in Mumbai, to actually crack the code on the problem of girls' education and ultimately of the illiteracy challenge in India, which is the greatest rate of illiteracy in the world. Marc Freedman, longtime friend, has been at the work of intergenerational wisdom, knowledge sharing, engagement for almost his entire career, including when he was a lot younger. So this is long-term work, founder of multiple organizations, beginning with the Experience Corps and most recently Encore. He's the originator of the idea of an Encore career, of the Purpose Prize. He's founded a campaign, and he's the author of 5 really wonderful books, including this most recently published book, How to Live Forever, The Enduring Power of Connecting the Generations. So we're going to talk with him about this intergenerational work that is going to unlock our potential as a society. And finally, we have Olivia Leland, and her bona fides come from her work as the person who actually pulled together the Giving Pledge and made that work, brought more people into that fold of committing themselves to philanthropy. And she reminds me that she also worked in government, and so she has a very rich career that prepared her to do this phenomenal work she's doing with collaborative change-making through CoImpact. So I think you'll agree we have a great lineup here, a remarkable set of people, and we're going to now put them on the spot. I will ask an opening question. We'll engage in some follow-up questions and conversation, and then we will go into questions from you, and then finally we'll wrap up and get you on your way to the next exciting session. So, with that, let me begin with Safeena, and I'd like to ask each of the panelists to reflect on the system they are trying to change. We believe in this forum that to change anything, you really have to understand it, and that understanding just doesn't come like a light bulb moment. It comes over time. But we all have to draw the boundaries somewhere to change these systems. And so I'm going to ask Safeena to describe for us the status quo that she encountered in India and she decided was unacceptable and ripe for change. Safeena.
Thank you, Sally. So I'll start really broadly. So India sort of ranks one of the worst in a lot of gender indicators. We have the highest number of out-of-school girls. We have the highest number of child brides, highest number of women and girls trafficked. And obviously at the heart of this is social, economic, and mindset issues. So when I wanted to sort of change this, this is a huge problem, and it's really broad-based. What are you going to go against? Patriarchy, you want to build equity. It's highly complex and interconnected and really difficult. So the lens that we took was very much saying girls' education is one point from where you can start that can create and you can accelerate impact. And girls' education, we sort of looked at that lens and from that lens because it helps you to solve 9 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Climate scientists rated number 6 out of 80 actions to reverse global warming. There's just so many things that you can do by educating girls, and you really build and accelerate towards equity at a societal level. But again, you know, it still leaves the problem really, really huge. India is a country of 1 billion people. Where are you going to start? It has 650,000 villages. Where exactly do you go to be able to accelerate and really make change possible? And so we went to the government and we said, you know, give us your worst areas. Where do you think the problem is most acute? And they gave us a list of 26 critical gender gap districts, of which 9 were in Rajasthan. So we found ourselves in Rajasthan. And that's when the real work kind of began. We went door to door to find every single girl that's out of school, creating an army of community volunteers with government support to really bring each and every one of those girls back into school. We've been using data and technology, and because it's such a heavy-duty approach, we go to every single household. So thousands of villages, it's like boots on the ground, you cover it. And over time, we've realized, it's that further scoping of the problem, we've realized that out-of-school girls tend to be concentrated in certain geographies. And now with our smartphone and our data and tech approach, we've actually come to this point that 5% of villages in India have 40% of the out-of-school girls. This is huge, because it means that over the next 5 years, if we really focus and really take an evidence-built model, a model that really shows results, we can actually solve 40% of the problem. And therefore, you can close the gender and literacy gap forever. And I think that's sort of thinking about the system you want to change, and then sort of bringing all the actors together, and then kind of narrowing it down to a point where you can really accelerate the impact that you want to see.
And nobody gave you the blueprint for that system. You had to get in there and figure out some of these things for yourself in partnership with government. Mm-hmm. But it didn't begin with a hothouse plan. It began with an appreciation for the system, and then you got to it, and the learning unfolded along the way. Is that fair?
Yes, so I think when we started, it was very common sense. Education had played a big part in my life, and even though I'd grown in poverty and with a lot of violence and abuse and all the rest of it, education had tipped everything, to a very different point for me. And so when I started, it was very simple, saying, I want to find every girl that's out of school. I want to make sure she's in school, staying and learning. So it starts from that common sense piece, the change that you really want to see at the individual level. And then, like you said, everything kind of, you learn along the way. You learn along the way, and you have to be alert, because that feedback from communities is critical. But your vision of success should be really clear. Yeah. If I close my eyes, I know what is a success, what does success look like. As an out-of-school girl, and she's now in her school uniform, and she's in classroom and learning. That's fantastic, yes. Another massive, massive, massive system, massive country, massive population, massive economic and development progress since 1980, highest rate of poverty alleviation and development in the world and in history, China. And so that story, of course, came at a cost. And this is a gentleman who woke up one day and said this cost has been, is really too much and has to be addressed. So June, tell us how you started to scope that problem of the Chinese environment and pollution and decided to go at it.
Thank you, Sally. Yeah, the last 40 years have seen tremendous growth in China, helping pull out hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. But as you said, it's also the vast increase of pollution discharge have also contaminated our air, water, and soil and coastal sea, exposed hundreds of millions.
Can everybody hear June? Can you hear him? Okay,
Can you
good,
hear me?
Good.
Okay.
He has a lot to say, and he's quite soft-spoken. So.
Okay,
Yeah.
I try to speak louder.
Good. Good.
Speak loud, and expose hundreds of millions to health hazards. And over the past 20 years, during my path to study and try to address this issue, I gradually realized that it's not just the lack of technology or even money. We have a system gap there, in our environmental management. We basically, past 40 years, we continue to copy laws and regulations on environment protection from the Western countries, but the enforcement has not quite followed. And in the West, people go to the court, NGOs go to the court to drive enforcement, but our judicial system has yet to function like that. So we lack the means, we can't simply copy the Western model on that. And I happen to believe, gradually I believe that it must come from a extensive public participation if we want to address issues of such a magnitude. And a lot of complexity, because it's not just our environmental agencies wouldn't want to enforce. Behind them, it's the local government, whose job review, basically job performance is rated by the GDP growth rate, almost like solely for many years. And so no surprise, they put GDP growth rate ahead of environmental protection. And so it's very hard for us to address that. I trust that we need extensive participation, but people must be informed. That's the prerequisite. So in the year 2006, 3 of us decided to form, to build IPE and started creating a national database on pollution. We take advantage of the vast development of IT technology, so we can be ambitious to do that, 3 of us. And but there's a catch. In China, data can be quite sensitive. That's another issue of our system. Back, more than 10 years ago, it was even more sensitive. When you can believe that only 2008, when air quality data started to be quite shared. Before that, it's almost like a safe secret. And so where can we find the data? We started browsing and compiling whatever data we can manage to put together. So the first year, we got 2,000 records of violations. 2,000 violators. We managed to put them together. But that's for a country with millions of factories. That's way too little. And so we decided that to create an index with our partner NRDC called Pollution Information Transparency Index, and use that to assess the performance of 120 major cities in China, not just to identify the gaps, but also help them to compare notes and learn from best practice. And gradually we see the expansion of transparency, along with rising recognition in China. First year, 2,000 records, and 2016, we got 60,000. 17, we got 160, and last year, it got doubled from there. So now, with that, more than 1 million records, and it gives us the chance to try to engage with many, many factories in China.
And this was a big bet on transparency and data and information and informed citizens. But you had a wonderful phrase about transparency that you shared with me, and I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about that. It was, well, let me read a quote from you. You said, transparency still seems as subordinate to regulation, but it's of greater importance. So radical, was it radical transparency? I can't remember. It was something really profound.
Yeah, we did discuss about that issue. I mentioned about we copy laws and regulations. It's quite there, but the enforcement and I trust it's even more important. But when you try to drive enforcement, you have to, you have to have two kids. But in China, I just give one example. When we push, the reason we push transparency to a disruptive level in China is because we lack the other two kids. For example, 2006 and 13. We, along with a group of 25 other NGOs, launched the Total Transparency Initiative, calling for the online monitoring data, the automatic monitoring data, to be disclosed real time. Nothing like this happened in the world ever, so we thought it's going to take many years. But at that moment, the Chinese government also bowed to the public voice, on the internet, to address the air pollution issue, the smog issue in China. So to our surprise, they required this to happen from 2014. And we happen to build, I trust that on 30 different platforms, it's not easy to have them, so to access them. So we built a Blue Map app, helping everyone to use their mobile phone to access this data, but also share that data. When we access this data, there are hundreds of polluting factories every hour not in compliance, and one of them is a major state-owned listed company and a steel plant, steel manufacturer. When we engage with it, it said as a listed company, it's not important to us. And as an NGO, we cannot do very much, like in the West or even probably in India. So we can't do much. But our users, our app users, continue to use our app to report that, the neighborhood, continue to report that, and tag in their official account, Twitter account, our Weibo account, over and over again, until one moment there's an open response from the agency saying that we require that company to change behavior. And after half a year, 3 shaft furnaces have been shut down, resulting in a reduction of not just 2,600 tons of sulfur every year, but 400 tons of particulates. That's 400 trillion micrograms of PM 2.5, all the fine particles, which the most damaging component of our smog problem.
Bravo. So the phrase was disruptive transparency, and I think that was the bet you made, and here you're seeing evidence that it is disrupting this incredible status quo. Olivia, let's turn to you and the funder perspective here. You came in with a thesis that there had to be more collaboration in the sector if we were ever going to have a go at these systems and driving real change. But how do you get comfortable? You've made your first round of grants now. How do you get comfortable that the system is actually well enough understood and scoped by the people you're preparing to fund?
Well, first I'll say I'm just so delighted to be here with you, Sally, and with this great panel and all of you. I think for me, the forum is also very special personally because of the many conversations that I've had here over the years, which actually influenced the design of CoImpact. And I was thinking before coming on for this panel that just down the hall from here a few years back, I had a conversation with one of the Skoll awardees who basically was bemoaning to me saying, exactly to your point, Sally, that there's so much discussion of systems change. It is a buzzword. We hear all about it. But why is more funding not designed in such a way to support systems change? And so it was through those conversations that CoImpact was born, because really our goal is to bring together a community of funders that are focused on supporting systems change. So what is it that we look for? It really is about everything that's already been discussed here, which is finding efforts where, to Safeena's point, there's a vision of success, not necessarily a full plan to get there because systems change is complex and messy, but a start of that, and also crucially there's an idea or an approach that has been proven at already a significant scale, and there's a coalition of actors that have come together involving government as well as others that are really involved in the system and coming together to work towards that vision of success. The other key piece here is that, and I know we have a lot of conversations about sort of what do we mean by systems change, but you can't take on the full system. And so what does that mean? Our focus is around education, health, and economic opportunity. Within that, each of the initiatives that we're supporting really picks something that they're focusing on. And so we've been describing that as sort of the lever or the fulcrum in the system that can have a huge impact, whether that's around learning outcomes, whether that's around looking for knowledge in healthcare, whether it's around community health, really sort of what is it that could then have a huge impact overall on the system. And that's what we look for in what we support.
And I hope as we engage in discussion here, we're going to be able to talk about some of the critiques of philanthropy, because you were actually trying to address some of those very critiques, but the volume has gone way up on critiques of philanthropy. And you're having brought together so many highly visible philanthropists and highly visible and reasonably successful organizations. I think you are already in the hot seat, so to speak. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. Marc and I are the two elders holding down this session. But you've done this work for many years to bring about the healthier intergenerational constructs, communities, relationships that will bring about, I think, a healthier society. But if demography is supposed to be destiny, and many believe the coming years will be full of animosity between the generations, how do you decide where the boundaries are? You know, I'm a baby boomer, card-carrying baby boomer, one of that burden of 65 plus million on the U.S. economy, not even a drag coefficient, just a drag. So how do we turn this ship around, Marc?
I thought you were going to tell me, Sally. Well, no, it's really interesting. You know, one of the things that I always come away from Skoll is a kind of a better understanding of my identity, you know, what it is that I'm actually doing. I didn't realize I was a social entrepreneur until I came here, and now I didn't realize that I was working on systems change, but it really, it has actually been helpful. And, you know, to your point about the demographics, you know, we hear a lot about how much longer people are living and about the number of people who are growing older. One of the things that has been less well appreciated is just the shift in the makeup of society. So in the United States this year, it's the first time ever in our country's history we have more people over 60 than under 18. So we're pioneers, we're leading this. And there's been a lot of consternation and hand-wringing about it for good reason, about what that could mean. But I've been really struck by how this dissonance between the predictions of what that demographic destiny is going to mean and what human evolution, human development tells us about the relationship between older and younger people, in particular, that the needs and the assets of the young and the old fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. So it turns out, you know, that there's a line that I'm fond of, that the real fountain of youth is the fountain with youth, right? You know, that is what, connecting with younger generations. It's a big Harvard adult development study that's been going for 80 years, and it's found that older people who connect with younger people and form bonds with them are 3 times as likely to be happy as those who fail to do so. And George Valent, the psychiatrist who led that study, says biology flows downhill, that this is deep roots. So how come this stuff doesn't happen naturally in everyday life to everybody's benefit? And it's taken me many decades to realize that it's a systems problem. And it's a shocking one in a way. America, the United States, began the 20th century as one of the most age-integrated societies in the world and ended it as one of the most age-segregated. And so how is it that that happened? And it's essentially a new system was created. We reorganized society along the lines of age. And we put young people into education institutions, middle people into workplaces, and older people into retirement communities and senior centers and nursing homes. And a lot of that was done for very admirable, justifiable reasons. You know, not just efficiency. You know, child labor laws led to educational institutions, Social Security, state pension led to mass retirement, and these other institutions. But the end result is a society that's not well prepared for these demographics. It's kind of a grievous wound in a lot of ways. A society. Ageism, potential conflict, kids versus canes, loneliness, right? The two loneliest groups in society. We're hearing so much about social isolation, loneliness, younger people and older people. And I think turning that around really requires looking at the system that seems like the oxygen in the air. It seems like it's always been this way, it's natural. But in fact, it was created in a short period of time by creative people who were trying to do something usually for the better, but the collective result. So, you know, I think for us, one is around mindset and culture. You know, rather than trying so hard to be young, we need to be there for those who actually are. And I think we need to be as creative around bringing people together in daily life as we were around separating them out. And that's where the social entrepreneurship and innovation comes into play. And so in a way, you know, when you realize, I think a lot of people don't even realize that this system of age segregation exists, but once you come to Skoll and you have your life explained to you, you then can kind of look at how it happened. You know, we created this culture, we created these institutional arrangements, we rerouted the river of life. How do we return it to its natural course?
Yeah, that's it's an incredible opportunity as well as this massive challenge. Olivia, let's return to you and these critiques of philanthropy. Edgar Villanueva yesterday talked about the colonization problem in philanthropy, and that's the kind of the noblesse, the nouveau noblesse oblige, if you will. And you've been on the hot seat. You've sat there with Anand Giridharadas and you've debated him. So how are you responding to this, and what do you think the evidence is that philanthropy actually can be a healthy catalyst for the kind of change that will actually make the argument that it has a role to play in these larger social systems?
So two things. First, I would say, I actually think that having this discussion around the critique of philanthropy is a very good thing, right? I think it's good for us to be questioning how can philanthropy, and crucially the second piece, which is exactly what you said in your question, which was what is the role that philanthropy plays? Because I think the key piece here is recognizing that philanthropy can't be the one driving change alone, ever. Across history, that isn't what we've seen. But really, where we have seen philanthropy playing a crucial role along with others is it's really about coming together, whether it's with government, whether it's really sort of putting the partners that you're supporting at the forefront of what it is that you're doing. And so I think what we need to see more of is, and I think this is where collaboration in philanthropy is so crucial, because sometimes when we talk about collaborative philanthropy, it's talking about funders coming together. But really, I think collaborative philanthropy is about what role philanthropy plays at one seat at the table along with others, and then recognizing that role. And crucially, it's also about listening. And I think that's where systems change fits so clearly in with this, which is in order to actually be part of something which really is driving system change, you have to listen. And that's important for everybody in the system, but especially for philanthropy, to say what is it that we can do along with others to be able to support that kind of change, which we won't be doing alone, but rather with others.
So it's early innings for your work at CoImpact, but are you already seeing some signs of enlightenment among funders as they have that one seat at the table with the, with the social entrepreneurs and with the members of communities and with the other organizations who are, with the governments who are part of this? Are you seeing some evidence that they are getting it?
I mean, I think absolutely. I mean, I think many of the conversations actually that I've had around what role should philanthropy be playing and about this critique has actually been with funders who are asking themselves these questions. I don't think that's true overall. I think there is there is a people, and actually the philanthropists that are part of the CoImpact community of funders are all having that kind of question, right? Which is, how is it that we can most effectively support efforts at driving systems change? That being said, I think we need much more, and I think that's where having these kinds of, and I think the discussions in themselves aren't enough, right? So I actually think it needs to be about being able to show what is it to come to the table, what does that look like, how do you actually partner with others, and then what does that mean in terms of seeing much more effective results as a result of it, because I think that's what will then make it hook and get others to join in.
Yeah, the argument, Paul Ilvasacker, who was one of the early presidents of Ford, used to call philanthropy society's passing gear. And I think that idea that it can be catalytic, that it should be risk capital, that is more experimental and more tolerant of failure, that it can play that role. And yet one of the critiques is for the major philanthropists is that they go after the safe bets.
The one thing I would say on the risk capital piece is that I think sometimes what in philanthropy people have taken risk capital to mean is therefore only fund earlier stage pilot efforts. And so I think what's exciting is starting to see this role of philanthropy also again as a seat at the table in supporting efforts that actually are proven, not at the systems level, but that are. And so what is it that you need to do in terms of philanthropy to be playing that bridge, obviously, again, with government and other larger funders, to be able to support these sorts of efforts as well?
Well, one of the innovations in the field has been around financing this work. And the Development Impact Bond has been a piece of that conversation and a piece of that experimental zeitgeist. So Safeena, you actually created the first Development Impact Bond. And I won't share the punchline of this experience, but I will ask you to reflect on some of your insights post-experience on the role of these vehicles.
Thank you, Sally, for that one. So I want to start with what was the intention of the Development Impact Bond. So as Educate Girls was scaling, and we went from 50 schools to 500 schools to 5,000 schools, the thing that worried me most was that as you scale and you get to thousands and you're hitting you're working with millions of children, are you still having the same level of impact? Or, is the value add the same for the millionth girl you're going to work with versus, 10 girls where you can actually see what's changing? So the idea was that if you had a payment by results contract, and if you could tie money to pure results, would you be able to then build an organization that had delivery to impact in its DNA? That's the intention of actually piloting something. And then the piece was that will this allow new money to then also come in? As social impact bonds had done, that philanthropic capital could have become risk capital, and you could have been paid back, and government money would have purchased the outcomes, and therefore it would have also become more performance oriented. So that was all of the intention, that because it had never been done in education, social impact bonds, and they had never been done outside of the US, UK, sort of first world countries. And most people were like, maybe it can't be done in a place like India where there isn't good quality data and there isn't, all of those pieces. So I think that's just the context of the bond. Got paid on two outcomes: enrollment of out-of-school girls as verified by a third party, and learning outcomes for children in government schools, regular government schools, and then with a supplementary learning program of Educate Girls. I'll just talk very quickly about the results and then get into the insights. The results over a 3-year period, the evaluator found that we were able to enroll 92% of all out-of-school girls, and they were staying in school. And in terms of learning, and the learning was delivered through a community volunteer, a 12th pass community volunteer and our staff. And we found that the learning results moved about 25% of target in year 1, 50% of target in year 2, and 160% by the end of year 3. So you saw exponential, which meant like the average rural child that we work with gained about an additional year of schooling through that. So absolutely phenomenal results. What the bond really taught us, and it is that we learned very rapidly. It decentralized, so the funders were just going to pay for the result, but they weren't sitting and prescribing to us what we should do on the ground, which I think is very, very, very important. It allowed us to decentralize further, so the problem solving got as close to the ground as possible. The field staff didn't keep asking us what to do. They just iterated and course corrected and moved forward. Brilliant things, right? But I think as now it's been about a year, and if we look back, I think there are still issues with instruments like that. They are very sharp instruments. And who decides what you're going to pay for and what the outcome should be for a tribal child, very far away from you, is of consequence and must be looked at very carefully. These are sharp tools. They're like ceramic knives. They'll chop really fast, but they'll chop your fingers off, if you're not careful. And they're children, and they're real human beings on the other end. Also, will it drive money and pull money towards things that can be easily measured? And will philanthropy become divorced from social justice and human rights and things that are not so easily measured but are extremely critical for society? So I would say those are the kind of key insights and things that we should reflect upon as these instruments evolve. And yes, so who's deciding the outcome? And currently, there's no new money still coming into these. So they still have to evolve to get to a point where there is actual new money that flows in here. But I think the issue of outcomes and who's deciding the outcomes, and this also goes back to philanthropy. Is it that the more money you have, you're going to decide what the outcome is for somebody really far away and how it should be measured? And I think that's a key piece. And that's where the role of government really comes in. They are accountable to their communities and how you do that. So,
and the role of citizens, who actually legitimize governments. So it's, there is a very big ecosystem.
So if I can just say, I think the things to take away from instruments like the bond and stuff is the things that we should definitely not be doing. And that is your activity-based financing, right? Don't tie money to line items in a budget and just track that, because that's not going to necessarily create accelerated impact. Philanthropic capital needs to be empathetic. Apart from being measurable, it needs to be full of empathy. It needs to be multi-year. It should be funding the vision of success, and it should be flexible. Like, give room for people to be able to move things around.
And be careful with the whetstone. I do not like the image of chopping fingers off with an impact bond. So anyway, be careful what you sharpen. Before we go on to questions, I want to ask June about, we're talking about context here, and the context for social impact bonds is definitely a Western, financial system context. But let's talk about China and the idea of face, because it was a really bold move to think that data and transparency would not shame and blame. So talk to us about how you actually manage the culture that values face as much as China does.
I appreciate this question. Yes, Sally, face is a complex issue. It has many cultural connotations in China. It's about respect, about self-dignity, and all of this. So people, don't want to lose face. Don't want others to feel that you're going to make them lose face. So, so it's quite a challenge. When we look into that, it's actually part of this. We talk about gap in our management system. This is part of the reason, for people to try to avoid open public criticism of even the polluters in some way to help them save face. And So in the case, but to us, you know, how to find the leveraging power to try to overcome that in a subtle way. That's our challenge. And I mentioned about that case, you know, our app users continue to report. I think when, you know, looking into that, we can see that it gives the local agency some sort of a power to try to overcome that face issue. You know, it's not just they got interfered by the officials now to enforce, but also it's a face issue. They live in the same city. You know, they usually have quite, you know, some of them have good contact, so they don't want to, you know, go very harsh with polluting factories. But with this repeated reporting from the local people, it makes it quite hard for them not to take action, because it's you know, with Twitter, our Weibo got hundreds of millions of users. And when you post something on that and repost it by some ones with a lot of followers, it's almost like an open accusation. You know, those officials, if they don't take action, they're going to be felt as failing their duty. And now, you know, the central government also go quite harsh on that. So it gives them a reason to engage with the polluting factories, saying that, look, buddy, it's not me who want to give you a hard time. It's the people, you know, it's the residents, A and B, and they just continue to report you and look, you know, I have to do something, and you better make a public disclosure. You know, it's not very difficult for you, you know, to explain what went wrong at least, and how you plan to resolve your problem. So one after another, this started happening, you know, so far some more than 1,800 of major, the largest polluting factories have bowed to that and openly respond. And then, you know, on the issue of, we try to, you know, when you look into this, we can see another line, that is our green supply chain work. You know, this name and shame, you mentioned about this name and shame game. People say it's just name and shame. But in China, you know, you can only shame those who has a name or who care about, who has a name that they care. But most of the factories, they are suppliers. They don't have a major brand. So they don't quite, in that way, care. Especially from an NGO, we don't have our massive, you know, power of communication. So they don't care. But there are those who care, like, you know, the first round, all these foreign multinational brands, you know, we managed to put into our database. They care about this issue because they made open commitment. When they have been found failing their duty, then they have to take action. And then we also help them to extend that into their supply chain. So one after another, you know, they started coming. So far, we have more than 7,500 of them.
Fantastic.
You know, because they worried about their contract, so they started coming to us.
That's fantastic. Marc, let me ask you one more question before we go to audience questions. You're unusual as a social entrepreneur because you're also a thought leader, 5 books, and you rely on a number of studies. In fact, you did one just this past year with Stanford. How do you think about that triangulation, doing the intellectual work as well as the on-the-ground work, and the way those two are reinforcing or not?
Yeah, well, I feel like a lot of ways the intellectual work is a kind of excavation process, you know, to try to understand why, you know, what's happening, and but it is very much a kind of interactive process. One of the things that I did as part of working on this book was to immerse myself in research and talk to thought leaders, but I hit the road and went all over the world and talked to people, and it just kind of convinced me that there was a congruence, that what developmentalists were telling us about human nature and how we're set up and what the roots to meaning, purpose, and happiness are, and what people were doing all over the the world, oftentimes against the odds, really fit together. And it reminded me, on the subject, there's a new book that's about to come out by David Brooks called The Second Mountain. It was excerpted in the Times the other day. And in the book, he has this incredible image of this guy, I think in California, who's got a bamboo grove outside his house that he hates. So it's reminding me, Safeena was talking about, he goes out, he gets all these tools, he chops the hell out of it, right? Kills it, then pours plant poison on top of it, and then covers it over with concrete. And a year later, a bamboo shoot is coming up through the thing. And it's just that, the human spirit has a way of kind of coming back. And so what all these academics and scholars are saying, I'm actually seeing people all over the world, planting these bamboo shoots. So there's a lot of chopping in this conversation.
Well, that's a wonderful image for us to take into questions. And I invite you to ask yours. There are microphones coming around. And the criterion is that you be brilliant and brief. Just state your name, your organization, if that's relevant, but ask a question, please.
Joe Confino at the HuffPost.
Why don't you stand up, please? Thank you.
Joe Confino at the HuffPost. There's the old saying that 95% of people try to change the world and only 5% try to change themselves. So I want to ask the panel, given that to understand systems externally, we need to understand systems internally. What are you doing about transforming, or what is the connection between transforming your own life and what your own system you're living that then supports you in the work outside? So what is the work you're doing that flows round, that you change yourself, you change the world, you change yourself, you change the world?
Got it. So who would like to take that on? The Sphinx, yeah.
I'm happy to take it.
Okay.
Because I think, so the sort of, I mentioned this earlier in terms of how I originally came up with the idea for CoImpact. I think one of the things around systems and systems change is actually the piece of listening. And that means actually, what does that mean in terms of how that changes your own perspectives and the bubble that you may be living in? And how do you go and talk to people that aren't maybe inside of that bubble so that you can then figure out how you can work with them and partner with them, and how that actually influences what you do. So personally, I had been, as Sally mentioned, I was the founding director of the Giving Pledge. I was sort of more connected in with philanthropy. So I felt like the bubble that I was in was really more philanthropy. And actually, thanks to support, which was also support from the Skoll Foundation as well as Pershing Square, I actually went and spent a year just finding people that weren't in that bubble. So basically people that I hadn't been talking to who might challenge sort of the perspective. So I started with a premise of sort of what it could be, but then wanted to go and sort of get outside and try to talk to people who might challenge those perspectives. And I think it's easy then once you sort of start to get going to then say, okay, now we figured it out. And so one of the things that that I think is sort of personally always really helpful is actually to go and find, especially the people who might disagree with you. And so this is again back to the sort of critique of philanthropy and things like that that are sort of pushing at you. And so I think that's the piece for me that is that extra, which is saying, okay, not in, I mean, it's amazing to be in rooms where sort of all have a similar vision, but it's also really helpful to go into the rooms where people might just completely disagree. And I find that's always helps to push the work forward.
Safeena, do you want to say something?
Yeah. So I thought I would start maybe with my home and how I've left the knives and the cooking to my husband and sort of building equity within the family. But I think your question just sort of reminded me that when we were building the model and we worked through community volunteers called Team Balika, I was insistent that they all had to be young women. And again, young men would come up and saying, I want to do this. And I think it was so much my own perspective and my own kind of biases around this that for the longest time I thought I was failing, that I wasn't getting enough women and I was getting more men. And it took me a long time. It was like this sort of, once we were sitting down with the team, and then it really hit me, saying, this is just so much more successful if young men are standing up in the village and saying every single girl in the village needs to go to school. And I had these like complete blinkers on, and it took a long time for me to actually just kind of come out. So I think that sort of on a personal level is sort of changing that kind of changed complete outlook for us as an organization too.
Anyone else before we move on?
Well, I'll go back to what you said at the beginning, Sally, about us being the elders. I started doing this work, I was in my 20s, and now I'm 60. And all along the way, under the wing of kind of one older person after another, and I realized that I was much better at receiving than giving. That I was pontificating about this stuff, I was soaking up all of this support, and I wasn't actually doing it. And that's been, it's been an important kind of realization for me, and I've kind of been making that transition, and it's deeply satisfying, but I realized I was kind of out of whack with everything that I was learning and saying.
That's revelatory. So, okay, yes.
Hi, building on the question about development bonds and collaborative philanthropy and all that, as people start trying to bring in the corporate sector and impact investors and all those, what do you worry about, and what do you think, I'm assuming you have worries about that, what do you think can be done to address your worries?
That's a great question, thank you. Impact investing, another offshoot of this field, and obviously at a point of that's asking for a good deal of introspection with the scandal around the Rise Fund and its leadership. So who would like to take this on? Impact investing. What do we have to worry about, and what are we doing about it?
I can tell you my worries. My worry is very much as to, like I said, who's deciding what that result is. And because most of the time what will happen is, or what you will lose out on, is inclusion and justice. There's equity, inclusion, justice. Those are the pieces when you get into very hard. So, and I can give you an example. In the DIB, we got paid on an out-of-school girl coming back into school, and then that out-of-school girl is 7 to 14 and all the rest of it. So if she's 6 years and 11 months, there's no incentive to enroll her. Or if you pay only on learning outcomes, and if you're paying on per percentage point improvement of learning outcomes, then there's a real risk of children whose learning is not moving to be pulled out of school, right? But that child may be malnourished, may be stunted, may be having other issues. So that's what I mean by, we will lose on inclusion and equity if we're not careful with going down that path. So I think that's the only big piece that really worries me. And like I said, is a lot of the funding going to move away from social justice causes and human rights issues and other big civil society problems versus towards things that can be measured easily.
Anyone else? Okay. Well, it is a big conversation that's underway. So.
Hi, my name is Rick Spence. I'm here covering the conference for Corporate Knights magazine in Canada. And I'm curious, the panelists are all making some good progress in reforming some tough systems, but I'm wondering, what's the most incorrigible part that you're still working to try and crack? And how do you think that's going to go?
So, resistance in the system. Where is that showing up, and what are you doing about it? June, do you want to think about that?
Yeah, definitely. It's there are still all these challenges that we're facing. All these years we've been trying to. 2007, when we got quite some data available, we launched a Green Choice initiative, calling for major brands to green their supply chain, but also calling for consumers to pay attention to what happened, in the consequences of different choices they make in their purchasing. And so all these years we've been able to making some progress with on the to-be side. We have several dozen major multinational and local brands. Every almost like regularly compare their list with our list, and their list of suppliers, our list of violators, and identify the problem and motivate thousands of them to change behavior. But on the consumer, behavior change part, we have all these records there showing quite clearly, every day in, day out, all your purchase, from all the IT products, the gadgets, to the textile, brands, they could have a real impact. The impact may not be near your neighborhood anymore, but it's somewhere. At this moment, China is the stop. We're definitely the workshop of the world. But it's again, we start to see migration of this global supply chain to Southeast Asia, South Asia, even Africa. How do we prevent another round of this migration of pollution? I think there's now a real opportunity. When China started, even used to be a black, people say blind spot of data, but now there's so much of that data available. Every day we're having more than 1 million pieces of this corporate data into our system, and so there's a possibility to track down wherever they go. We can track them down. There's now an emerging opportunity on that, and how do we tap into that? And we still haven't quite figured out a way. As a Chinese NGO, we lack the ability to engage more, regionally, let alone say globally. So I'm so happy to have the chance to be back to the Skoll community and trying to see whether there are possibilities to work with like-minded awardees. Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for the question. Other questions? Yes?
Hi, I'm Barbara Van Dalen. I'm the president and founder of Given Hour. I'm a psychologist, and my focus is on emotional health and well-being. And this question, I started thinking about it for Marc, but I think it applies to others on the panel as well, and it's about the media. When we think about the work you're trying to do, the intergenerational work, and in our country, in the US and in many countries, the media is focused on the value of youth and not the value of people like us, our age. And so, but I think it applies also to other systems challenges when the media is working against us. And what are your thoughts? What do you see as progress in terms of getting the media to see the value and the importance of doing this work to change these systems?
Yeah, if you'll allow me, that was a great question. And I think, Marc, it would be a good question for you to address, but I'll share with you an exchange that I had with Jeff Skoll, the founder of the Skoll Foundation, a few weeks ago, as there was an article in the New York Times about a resort and a fellow who was creating a resort for older folks in Mexico, older folks all over, but the resort, I think, was in Mexico, so they could examine their life and their life's choices and what they were going to do with this phase of their lives. And Jeff was really taken with this because he and I have been very close to an organization called the Elders over the years, and I think a lot of those remarkable people. So here's what he said. In the aging, developed world, older folks could and should be a great resource, but are more often seen to be a burden rather than a treasure. And that's the challenge. And media, I think, has a big role to play in helping to turn this around. So, Marc, why don't you speak to this?
Sure. That's great, that quote. So this is about Chip Conley, who started something called the Modern Elder Academy, and he has a new book out called Wisdom at Work. And he's got this really interesting personal story. He started a hotel chain in California, the Joie de Vivre hotel chain, retired in his 50s, was kind of going to go off into seclusion, and then the founders of Airbnb sought him out and asked him to come in and be their mentor, which he did, but then discovered along the way that he was every bit as much a kind of intern as he was a sage. He was learning as well. So he came up with this idea of being a modern elder, and when you think about it, it's the Robert De Niro role in The Intern, right? He's mentoring Anne Hathaway and learning this new. So in some ways, the media is kind of contributing to, I think I've been really struck on my issue, how much more this alternate storyline that runs against the system is starting to gain ground. But one of my favorite illustrations, this is very US focused, but Netflix has a series called The Kaminsky Method with Michael Douglas and Alan Arkin. And there's a scene in it where Michael Douglas, who's this Lee Strasberg-like acting coach, he's diagnosed with prostate cancer. He's really down on his luck. He's wandering through this park, and then he hears the sound of children out in a distance, and he kind of wanders over to this playground, and he's seeing all these kids playing, and his spirits are really lifting. And then in the background, you see all these mothers kind of coming together, and then a police officer shows up, and he's going to get arrested, you know, for enjoying being around. And it just kind of reminded how deeply ingrained the system is that we're working against.
Well, one of Jeff's theories after reading this piece in the Times was that the term elder is showing up more and more, and it's not always showing up with a negative connotation. And that's, you know, that bodes well for us, Marc. I think there's something's cracking here. So, but we have to drive that. Obviously, we have to help drive that narrative. So. So great question. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Is there someone with a microphone? Heather.
Hi, I'm Heather Grady with Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, and thanks so much for this discussion. I think a real strong tension in this area that we deal with is that when we're talking about systems change, we're looking at a system that's bounded. You've talked about things like making sure people have the right experience, the right entry point, sometimes a proven model. But I think some of the fundamental things we're tackling have never had a solution yet, and so more philanthropic capital has to go into solutions and impact that we have not even envisioned yet. So we're asking people to have a vision and a clear model, but we need solutions that aren't there yet. I'm just wondering if you can talk about that tension and what you see in the philanthropy sector, where people are willing to fund the coalition building and the discovery and the, you know, some of the critical analysis that happens to be done that really is longer term work.
Yeah, and that longer term, let's put a pin in that, because systems change, as I said, does not happen in the blink of an eye. It does happen over time. You have to look at the arc. There will be setbacks and, you know, lurches forward, but it's a continuous arc, and I don't think we get to declare victory and say, done, solved, perfect, you know, we move on. So that's a really important point. But Olivia, maybe this is for you.
Sure. I mean, I think first, I think that in overall, we need philanthropy to do a number of different things, right? And I think when it comes to systems change, I absolutely agree on the piece that there needs to be funding and, crucially, support, and which means also beyond the funding on the coalition building, which means being able to take that sort of longer term view, and also, again, bringing funders together so that they're aligned behind this, so that people aren't pulling in different directions towards whatever that long-term vision is, and also recognizing that it's never, when it's about systems change, it's not about just one organization, it is about this coalition. At the same time, I think while there needs to be more funding, absolutely, for sort of finding, to your language, Heather, the solutions, or really sort of looking at for earlier stage, I think there is a huge gap when it comes to things that are proven. They will look different when they get to the systems level, but for some reason, and this was a conversation I've had, I think, with many people here in the Skoll community, philanthropic funding tends to step away when there is something which actually really is reaching into the hundreds of thousands or sometimes into the millions. And yet, what does it take to really get to that sort of system-wide impact? There still is a role for philanthropy, again, crucially, in collaboration with others, and there needs to be other capital coming in. But I think that sort of stage of being able to support things where there is an idea and approach, again, it's going to look different when it gets there, but it has been something that is proven, and the coalition is starting to come together, and taking that longer term view is a really, really important role for philanthropy. And we're starting to see more of that, but I think we need to see much more of it.
And Safeena, do you want to say something about your funders? Your funders? You don't want to say anything about your funders? Okay, okay. I think we're at the point maybe where we're ready to wrap up, and I would like to ask each of the panelists to reflect on their personal journey, and acknowledge that this is hard work. It's not for the faint of heart. It's not for anybody who isn't up to the challenge. But inevitably, there will come moments when you're ready to quit, because the work is too hard. It's too frustrating. The challenges are enormous. The critiques come fast and furiously, especially if you're making headway. So was there a moment when you actually thought, this is too hard, I'm ready to quit? And if you did, what brought you back? So, June, may I ask you?
Tough question. I would like to say I never had that moment. One thing for us, I know, all the awardees are addressing very, sometimes, super big issues, and we happen to pick some of the issues which are probably not quite easy to resolve. People say this is about the air, the water, and the soil, the coastal sea, and when will that come to an really solve the problem? And so one way to continue to carry on is to be hopeful, and to be hopeful, one way the way is to forget the bad experience, and only I talk so much about the progress, because that's one way to cheer yourself up, and but we all, obviously have some moment like that, especially in those early days of our work, and at that moment there's still very sharp conflict between, the so-called development and environmental protection, and so not just we have all this very sometimes very angry, factory owners coming to us, but also they, I'm not the most worried about them, but I worry they're not coming to us, they come to their contact, their buddies, within the agencies, and they give us sometimes a real hard time at those moments, and there are times that we're not sure whether we can continue to operate tomorrow, and there are times, even whether I can go home tomorrow, that those are the, go home. It's already a question, and so at that moment, even after that, there are changing situation in China. The government paid far more attention on the environmental protection. The top leadership prioritized environmental protection. We give credit for all these efforts made. Having said that, even to the last days of my mom, I think I continue to get her worry about me. As a grown-up son, quite a traditional, in some way quite traditional Chinese. I grew up in China, educated in China. To be not filial is quite, give you quite a sense of duty. To subject your parents to concern even when you grow up, and it's not very, very good. But what keeps me going is that at the end of the day, all throughout my journey, I have all this moment of so many of local people give me their stories, their sufferings, sometimes even on their deathbed. You know, they give me so much trust. But me as an individual have not much money, no power, no administrative power at all. And I just continue to feel the only way to help them is to cross the message to more people, you know, to those who, you know, to not to allow their voice to be drowned in this super complex global economy. And so that, you know, I found that even to now it's true. Every 100 records of violation we put into our database, we got one factory coming to us, respond to us. So at the beginning, 2,000, but now, you know, we have over 900,000, you know, nearly 1 million, and we got nearly 10,000 of them coming to us.
And that's happened one at a time.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Safeena.
So for me, it happened last year. One of the girls, Nikki, she and my daughters grew up together. And Nikki comes from a very poor house. She's finally in the 10th grade. She would come to our house on a little scooter. And we thought, like, oh my God, Nikki, you know, she was, in my view, like where I want to see all of my work end up. And Nikki committed suicide last year. She killed herself because she didn't get good marks in her 10th grade. And it was, for me, I felt like a hypocrite. I felt like, what am I talking about scale and numbers when the child right below my eyes, I couldn't help. And I think that to me, I came very, very, very close to giving up. And then my daughter said to me, Mama, maybe it's my fault because I was friends with her and she never told me that she was going to do this. And like listening to my daughter, I think really made me realize that the work has to continue. And it's difficult, and it's not easy, and it's messy. And even when you think everything is going to become really successful, things change.
I think we all see where that passion for including the clients and ensuring that these new vehicles don't ever pull us away from whose interest is really at stake here. Thank you, Safeena. Marc.
This is, you know, at a very different level. But I when I started doing this work, I kept saying, oh, you know, by 2020, you know, all of these big changes in society will have happened. They're not just demographic predictions, and there'd be this great rallying around, you know, this issue. And now the changes have happened, and that hasn't happened. There's no public policy. There's nobody who's talking about this in those kinds of circles. Philanthropy, when we were started, we were basically a creation of Atlantic Philanthropies. They, you know, were up in arms because only 2% of, you know, philanthropy was going into these issues, and we had to do something about it. Now it's 1%. And so I find, you know, as the work becomes more important, the investment is shrinking, and that, you know, the salvation really has just been that there's so much more going on at the grassroots level. There's this kind of ferment, and by young people. So I'll just like tell this one story because it's Ashoka related. I just spent 2 weeks ago. I went to the Mercy Center in Burlingame, California, to see a project called Nuns and Nuns, and the nuns, N-U-N-S. And N-O-N-E-S, and the N-O-N-E-S are millennials, you know, who answer these surveys and say that they're spiritually inclined, but they have no religious affiliation. They check none, and nuns are these sisters who've devoted their lives, in many cases, to fighting poverty and to, you know, working on refugee issues, and they've been seeking each other out, and there are now 17 meetups around the country of nuns and nuns, and they've just started this residency in Burlingame at the Mercy Center where millennials, including a guy named Adam Horowitz, who just wrote a paper called "What's a Young Jewish Boy Doing in a Convent," are And the sisters are there, their orders are shrinking and dying out, but they want the essence of the work to live on, not necessarily the form, and these millennials are carrying on the work. So, I just feel like, again, it's the bamboo popping up through the sidewalk that keeps me going.
And so we have to pay attention to see those shoots. Olivia.
I love the bamboo popping up through the sidewalk. Think about that. We've talked about this, but I think it's very much not the norm yet to be focusing on systems change and to be focusing on collaboration and philanthropy. I was thinking, I had a conversation right at the time, so I'd sort of I spent a year, I talked to hundreds of people around the world, so I sort of had the germ of an idea for CoImpact, and I went and talked to a philanthropist whom I knew well, and I said, here it is, I'm so excited, I went to explain it to him, and he said, Olivia, you're crazy, not gonna work. No one's ever going to do this. Philanthropy is deeply personal. No one wants to come together and pool funds and do things that are actually supporting where you can't see what the impact is. So we had an hour-long conversation, which admittedly didn't go much further than that. But I kept sort of going at a different angle, but what if this and this and this? And actually, interestingly, I just saw him again a few weeks ago, and he said I was wrong. And I think for all of us, it's those moments when, not about proving people wrong, but rather that it is that you get sort of a push when it's something that is that's not the norm. And I guess for me, since obviously our lens is we're sort of in between and bringing together funders and then supporting efforts, what keeps me going is two things. One, which is, as Sally, you mentioned, we've actually now, it's what's so exciting is that we actually get to support these amazing initiatives. And that's sort of obvious, but that's really what keeps us going, along with getting to work with funders who see this and see that that's really the direction we need to be going. And then in those moments, because like all of us, I'd love to say there aren't those moments, but we all have them. And obviously it's partially going and talking to my family and getting them to push. But also I have the great fortune to work with an amazing team. And I think that's really what gets me up in the morning, is the chance to work on these issues with an incredible group of people. That's what does it.
It's a privilege, and it's been a privilege to be here with you this morning. Please join me in applauding this wonderful group of panelists. Thank you so much, and I'll leave you with that wonderful Gandhian insight. First they ignore you, then they mock you, then they fight you, and then you win. So let's go on and do some fighting and winning here. Thank you.